As Roald Dahl famously said in his story about Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, there is no life I know that compares to pure imagination. Living there, you'll be free if you truly wish to be. And I know from my own experience, if I hadn't been able to imagine and create on a regular basis during this past year, I would certainly have been very lost. And now I would like to turn the service over to our Reverend Charlie Davis, who will share with us the risks and rewards of imagination.
The events of this past week are paradoxical because at the same time they show both a lack of imagination and an excess of imagination. Somehow security forces could not imagine white supremacists storming the Capitol. And even though they'd been posting about it for months, even selling t-shirts that said Civil War, January 6, 2021. And even after they had stormed the Capitol, some officials refused to send the National Guard, wondering how could white people possibly be dangerous? Many of us watching found it easy to imagine that things would have been different if the protesters were black. And that it was different when the protesters were women, merely sitting in front of the Capitol, and over 300 got arrested. The terrorists believe fanciful things. The QAnon people believe that Democrats are running a satanic pedophile ring, and they believe that Trump is somehow the savior that will stop them. There is a lot of religious overtones, and they believe that the election was rigged, even though Republican election officials certified it, and Republican-appointed judges said that there was no evidence of fraud. There are risks and rewards of imagination. When one can imagine potential danger, one can make preparations. When one imagines dangers that are not there, one acts dangerously. If we fail to imagine the possibility of good, we will give up in despair. When we imagine the good, it inspires us to work towards it. But what happens when one imagines a good that is impossible? When is hope a delusion? The words of the Red Queen and Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland both horrify and inspire me. Why, sometimes I have believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. It inspires me when I think of how each of us need to break open our minds to look beyond the horizon, to seek the paths that have never been found, to follow the words of Robert Kennedy, who said, "Some see things as they are and ask why. I dream things that never were and ask why not." But what happens when flights of fancy go too far? When does wariness cross over into paranoid delusion? When does self-confidence devolve into narcissism? When does courage become empty bravado? And when does the hope of imagination become the opiate of escapism? When does the promise of a better world become passive waiting for pie in the sky by and by? Sometimes our dreams hold us too tightly. Our imaginations are so pleasing that we avoid reality. When imagination becomes an end in itself, it ceases to inspire us to do better. But sometimes speculation is the only way to change the current reality. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison. Believing in impossible things was the only way to stay alive. Nelson Mandela wrote in his 1995 book, Long Walk to Freedom, "Prison itself is a tremendous education and a need for patience and perseverance. It is above all a test of one's commitment. I always knew that someday I would once again feel the grass under my feet and walk into sunshine as a free man." And because he believed this, he had to find ways to keep that hope up while he was in prison, when apartheid was actually getting worse instead of getting better. And one thing he did was exercise his body. I've always believed that exercise is the key not only to physical health, but to peace of mind. In prison, he had to believe the impossible in order to survive. And he had to keep himself strong so that if he survived, he would be able to do something. And he had to do this all in the face of evidence that said it was hopeless. Upon his release, he held on to those ideals. And even though his ideals were not met in his lifetime, he became a president and had to deal with the politics of being a president. And politics is always less than our ideals. 4 years after his release from prison, he knew that didn't change everything. The struggle continued. In a speech in Moira, South Africa, he said, "Why is it that in this day and age human beings still butcher one another simply because they dare to belong to different religions, to speak different tongues, to belong to different races? Are human beings inherently evil? It is erroneous to attribute to the human character a universal trait it does not possess," he continued. "That being either inherently evil or inherently humane. I would venture to say that there is something inherently good in all human beings, deriving from, among other things, the attribute of social consciousness that we all possess. And yes, there is also something inherently bad in all of us, flesh and blood as we are, with the attendant desire to perpetuate and pamper the self. From this premise arises the challenge to order our lives and mold our mores in such a way that the good in all of us takes precedence. In other words, we are not passive, hapless souls waiting for manna or a plague from on high. All of us have a role to play in shaping society. In the United States of America, in this current time, things look bleak. We are so divided. People live in different realities. It seems at times the gap is impossible to breach. I have experienced, and I have heard so many of you talk of your experience of not being able to talk to family members and wondering, how did someone who grew up with me, how did someone that was such a dear friend and me get so separate in the way we see the world? It seems that each attempt at progress is met with resistance. And yet, in the midst of this, we must believe that the impossible ideals of peace and harmony and equality and liberty are possible. We must act as if they are reality. The inherent worth and dignity of human beings is currently hiding behind the clouds of discord. The world has turned away from the sun, but in the darkness we can see the light of other stars. We are past the winter solstice. We know that the days are getting longer, but we also know that January is usually colder than December. Things often get worse on their way to getting better. There's the saying that it's darkest before the dawn. And we must continue to remember that dawn will break. And when dawn breaks, our work will have just begun. Remember that the sun warms the earth even at night. Let us dream at night the things we will do in the day. We need to imagine things so that we can plan for them. And we need to be able to see the reality that is hidden. While I was watching 6 people eventually die on Capitol Hill, glued to my TV, over 4,000 Americans died from COVID on January 6th. Last year, this virus was just starting to kill. It was a rumor. It was something far away in China. The scientists and mathematicians predicted numbers like this, and it was so fantastical that it would get this bad if we didn't take it seriously. And so many people did not believe. And some refused to believe. Day after day, the death kept on mounting. But because the death was hidden, many people chose to deny that it was even happening. And these deaths will continue and they will grow until the vaccine is distributed. We have never vaccinated people on this scale worldwide. Yet we must imagine how to do it. Make plans, try them out, learn from other countries if they figure out how to do it before we do. Teach other countries if we figure out the way. But we can't wait till we have it all figured out. We have to try. We have to try the best strategy that we can figure out. And forgive each other when one strategy fails and we have to try another strategy. Because I imagine that will happen. But we must imagine that it's possible, or else it will be impossible. We must learn how to gain the trust of those who do not trust vaccine. Racial injustice in medical care is part of the problem. We must find a way to build trust where trust has been betrayed. And we must build trust amongst people who have been lied to about delusions and unscientific garbage about what vaccines actually do. Our Declaration of Independence declared that all men were created equal. And it was felt in the language of those days that the word men also included women. But we know it didn't. And Native Americans and African Americans were also excluded. They imagined something in 1776. It is a dream that has never come true and has been shown to be false over and over in our history. It is a dream that will never come true unless we believe it. If we believe it is not true, then we enter into a death spiral where the world is divided between us and them, the deserving and the undeserving, the heaven sent and the hell bent. War for domination will continue. But if we believe that it actually is true, we will work to eliminate all the things that make it seem false. We will strive for equality, not just in theory, but in fact. There's much unemployment in our nation, and some business models are forever changed. Bars and restaurants, concerts and sporting events, all will have to change as this world gets more crowded and more meat is produced in unsanitary conditions. More cross-species viruses will arise. This is not the first such virus, and it won't be the last. We must imagine new ways to raise food. Some people are learning how to grow meat in a laboratory by only taking a few cells from an animal and replicating those cells. An animal is allowed to continue to live. My cousin is a vegan, and she's always sharing recipes of how to eat without harming animals at all. Our imagination and technology has allowed human life to flourish, but often at the expense of other species and also at the expense of other members of our community. The state of Nebraska has announced that illegal immigrants will not be getting the vaccine. The illegal immigrants that work in the meat factories and processing that are sending the meat to our grocery stores. The hatred for these people who are doing the hard work that feeds America is putting all of us in danger. There is so much to do and so much to learn. The world is forever changed. I've reduced the miles that I have traveled during the pandemic. Every time I fill up with gas, I try to remember, when was the last time that I filled up with gas? Will I continue this conservation when I'm allowed to move around more? How many people will continue to work at home now that we have found that it's more possible than we had imagined? And this will probably result in empty office spaces in our downtowns. Will we have the imagination to convert those spaces into living quarters so every human being living in this country can have a home? How will we learn to live in harmony with nature? Here in New Bern, we might stop building near the rising sea and learn to live on higher ground. After hurricanes, we should not rebuild until we reimagine, then build on those new dreams. Of course, these new solutions will inevitably lead to new problems. That seems to be always the way. The never-ending process of creating and destroying and creating. Both being born and dying involve pain. Does this make life a series of meaningless events? Or can we create meaning through our imagination? This is a huge question. When I came to this part of the sermon, I was overwhelmed. I sat back in my easy chair. As I lie there in a stupor, my cat crawled across my belly. I do not understand the cat, and the cat doesn't understand me. I scratched her, and she purred. Did she rub against me to mark me as her territory? Or was she a goddess demanding to be served? Were we sharing mutual affection? Or was she just a mere animal needing to be comforted? Was I taking a break from sermon writing? Or was I finding inspiration? There is so much meaning to imagine, even in the petting of a cat. Both of us might die tomorrow. Does that rob each moment of its meaning? Does that erase all meaning? Or does it make each moment that we are aware more and more precious? Our mind is a wandering thing. It will always seek meaning. We can choose hedonism or suffering or a middle path. And we always have the power to imagine. We have the power to make the happiest moment dire. One stops enjoying a kiss the moment one suspects a lover's motive. And I have heard laughter at funerals because of the resilience of the human soul. Intellectually, we can analyze and conclude that life has no meaning, but inevitably, we will find something that matters to us, which gives it meaning. The events of the past few days prove that people can observe the same facts and come to wildly different conclusions. This is troubling, but it is also a source of hope. Think of when you have changed your mind and what caused it. Perhaps it was peer pressure that made you conform. Or perhaps that very same pressure got your back up and made the hair on your neck stand up, and you had to escape and make a new reality. Whenever we are stuck, we must take time to imagine a way out. We may advance or retreat, or we may use our isolation to contemplate, or we may come to love where we are stuck, realizing it's where we belong. Or we might improve where we're stuck by inviting others in. Or we might choose a new path. When we think that all is lost, we can imagine more. The impossible, reinterpreted, becomes possible. The impossible thing you imagine before breakfast may be real by the end of the day. May we bless and be blessed.
Thank you, Reverend Charlie, for encouraging us to hold on to our hopes and our dreams.